Raymond Collins, a 60-year-old Canadian widower, thought he had found salvation in Priya Sharma, a 26-year-old woman from India, but their marriage of promise unraveled into a web of lies, betrayal, and murder when he uncovered her secret affair with his lifelong best friend. In a quiet corner of Ontario, the winters stretched endlessly, and the cold seemed to seep into the bones of everyone who lived there. Raymond Collins had grown used to that kind of silence, the kind that came after decades of routine. He was 60 years old, a retired construction worker with hands that told the story of hard labor and a heart that had been softened by years of devotion to a woman he once called the love of his life. When his wife of 30 years died after a brief illness, he discovered that grief could be louder than any storm. The house they had shared felt hollow, every room echoing with memories of laughter that had long faded. Evenings were the worst, meals eaten alone, a television humming without meaning, and long nights of restless thoughts. Raymond was not a man who craved riches or excitement. What he wanted was simple: someone to talk to, someone to sit beside him as the snow piled against the windows, someone who could fill the silence that had grown unbearable. His neighbors described him as a generous man, always ready to lend a hand with a shovel or share a story about the old days. But behind his polite smile was a loneliness that deepened with every passing season. It was during one of those lonely nights that he discovered online dating. He scrolled through profiles without much hope, until one caught his attention. Priya Sharma was young, beautiful, and from India, her photos filled with color and life that contrasted sharply with the grayness of his days. She spoke kindly, complimented him, and seemed genuinely interested in his world. For the first time in years, Raymond felt a spark of warmth. He believed fate had finally offered him a second chance at love. The early days of their marriage painted a picture of happiness that seemed almost too perfect. When Priya arrived in Canada, Raymond felt as though he had been reborn. He proudly showed her the quiet streets where he had grown up, the diner where he met his late wife, and the small house that now belonged to them both. For Raymond, it was not just about sharing his past. It was about building a future with someone who made him feel alive again. Priya appeared delighted, smiling often for photos and learning to pose against snowy backdrops that were so different from the warm skies of her homeland. Friends and neighbors who met her commented on her beauty and grace, and Raymond basked in the glow of their admiration. Raymond introduced Priya to Greg Patterson, his oldest and closest friend. The two men had shared decades of memories, from late nights at the pub to fishing trips by the lake. Greg seemed genuinely happy for him, clapping him on the back and praising his courage to start over. Seeing his best friend welcome Priya only deepened Raymond's belief that his choice had been right. Everything seemed to fall into place, and for a while, the loneliness that had consumed him was pushed into the shadows. But beneath the surface of cheerful dinners and posed photographs, things began to feel different. Priya grew distant at home, her laughter less frequent when it was just the two of them. She spent long hours scrolling through her phone, messaging people Raymond had never met. When he reached for her hand, she often pulled away with an excuse about being tired or unwell. Still, Raymond convinced himself that she simply needed time to adjust. After all, she had left everything behind to be with him. In his mind, patience was the proof of true love. As the months passed, small details began to disturb the calm surface of their marriage. Raymond had always been careful with his money, living within his means and saving for the future. But after Priya entered his life, his bank account seemed to shrink faster than he could manage. Expensive shopping bags piled up in their bedroom closet, filled with clothes and accessories he knew he could never afford on his pension alone. When he asked about them, she brushed his concerns aside, insisting that looking her best was part of settling into a new country. He gave in, not wanting to upset her, but deep inside he began to feel a quiet unease. It wasn't only the money that worried him. Conversations about children, travel, or even long-term plans were met with vague answers or quick changes of subject. When Raymond tried to speak about building a future together, Priya's face would harden, and she would return her attention to her phone or the television. There was no warmth in her eyes, only impatience. He noticed, too, that she rarely showed affection unless they were in public. To friends and neighbors, she smiled brightly, slipped her arm through his, and looked every bit the devoted wife. But once the front door closed, that warmth faded as though it had never existed. The turning point came when she placed immigration papers in front of him, asking for his signature. She told him it was simply a formality, that it meant nothing but security for their future. Raymond hesitated, but the thought of losing her was unbearable. He wanted desperately to believe her, to trust that she was sincere. With a trembling hand, he signed. He believed love would hold them together, never imagining that this was exactly what she had been waiting for all along. The unease that had been growing inside Raymond finally reached a point where he could no longer ignore it. Priya's absences became more frequent, her explanations less convincing. She claimed to be visiting friends or attending cultural events, but she often returned late at night or not at all. When she did come home, she carried an air of detachment, moving through the house like a guest rather than a wife. Raymond tried to suppress his doubts, but every unanswered call and every unexplained trip gnawed at his mind. One evening, unable to sleep, he sat in his armchair with his laptop open, scrolling through social media. He told himself he was just wasting time, yet his heart pounded as if he were searching for something. Then, like a cruel twist of fate, the images appeared. His breath caught as he recognized her instantly. Priya stood on a golden beach, dressed in bright summer clothes, her arms draped around a man. The man was laughing, his hand possessively on her waist. Raymond's chest tightened as he leaned closer. The face was one he knew better than almost any other. It was Greg, his best friend, the person he trusted more than anyone else. The photos showed them on vacation together, sipping drinks, lounging by the water, smiling as if they were celebrating a love that had always been theirs. Each picture was like a blade to Raymond's heart. The betrayal was complete, not only from the woman he thought he had rescued from loneliness, but from the friend who had shared his secrets and stood beside him for decades. At that moment, the illusion shattered. He realized with brutal clarity that the marriage had been nothing more than a carefully crafted deception, and he was the fool who had believed every word. Raymond's world collapsed the moment he saw those photographs. The house that once felt like a refuge now pressed in on him like a cage. He replayed every detail of the past year in his mind. The way Priya avoided his touch, the mysterious expenses, the sudden trips, the coldness that grew between them. Every memory seemed poisoned with deceit. What hurt most was not just Priya's betrayal, but Greg's. This was the man who had stood by his side through life's triumphs and losses, the man he had trusted more than a brother. The thought of them together while he sat alone in the Canadian winter filled him with a bitterness that gnawed at his soul. Days turned into nights without rest. Raymond stopped eating regular meals, pushing aside plates of food until they went cold. He withdrew from his neighbors, avoiding the people who had once admired him for finding love again. When he looked in the mirror, he no longer recognized himself. His once sturdy frame had withered, his eyes sunken, his face lined not just by age but by humiliation. What had started as heartbreak slowly transformed into anger, a burning rage that refused to be extinguished. Priya's return from her trip only deepened his torment. She carried herself with arrogance, as though nothing had happened, as though she had not been exposed. Her indifference became unbearable. Raymond no longer saw the young wife he once adored. Instead, he saw a stranger who had stripped him of his dignity and played with his emotions for her own gain. In his heart, grief and fury wrestled for control, and each day he felt himself slipping further from the gentle man he had always been. The breaking point was no longer a question of if, but when. The night of tragedy came in the deep stillness of January, when the snow outside fell in thick, muffling layers and the cold pressed against the windows. Inside the house, the atmosphere was heavier than ever before. Priya returned late, her perfume lingering in the air, her laughter from a phone call echoing down the hall. Raymond sat in his chair, motionless, his mind consumed by the images he could never erase. For hours, he had turned over the betrayal in his head, his thoughts darkening with each passing minute. By the time she walked through the door, his patience and grief had hardened into something far more dangerous. Investigators later reconstructed the events through evidence and testimony. They believed a confrontation began in the living room. Objects were overturned, a lamp shattered, and blood marked the floor in a violent trail. Raymond, overwhelmed by rage and humiliation, lashed out at the woman he once believed was his salvation. The controlled, quiet man neighbors had known for decades was gone, replaced by someone driven to the brink by deceit. The struggle ended with Priya lying lifeless on the carpet, the silence of the house broken only by Raymond's ragged breathing. When the police arrived, alerted by a neighbor who had heard screams piercing the snowy night, they found Raymond sitting on the sofa. He did not run, nor did he resist. His clothes were stained, his eyes hollow, and his voice eerily calm. He admitted to what he had done, offering no excuses beyond the simple, devastating truth that he had been destroyed by betrayal. The scene was both shocking and heartbreaking. A home once meant to represent hope and new beginnings had instead become the final stage of a love story twisted into violence. The aftermath of the crime shook the small community to its core. Court proceedings revealed the layers of deception that had been carefully hidden during the marriage. Friends and neighbors listened in disbelief as prosecutors presented evidence showing that Priya's relationship with Raymond had been orchestrated from the beginning, her affection merely a performance designed to secure residency in Canada. Witnesses spoke of her secret trips, her constant demands for money, and the vacation she had taken with Greg, the very man Raymond had once trusted above all others. The betrayal was undeniable, but so was the brutality of the act that ended her life. The courtroom was filled with tension as Raymond, frail and broken, sat before the judge. His confession left little room for defense. Though his lawyer argued that years of loneliness, manipulation, and humiliation had pushed him to a breaking point, the law could not excuse the taking of a life. The jury found him guilty of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for many years. Priya's family in India mourned the loss of their daughter, unable to reconcile the image of her tragic death with the woman they had sent abroad to begin a new life. Greg, meanwhile, disappeared from the public eye. His role in the affair left him shunned by those who had once called him a friend. He sold his house and moved away, leaving behind whispers of shame and cowardice. Raymond's modest home was sold, its walls stripped bare of memories. What began as a story of second chances ended in devastation for all involved. The case lingered in headlines, a chilling reminder of how love, betrayal, and loneliness can intertwine to create a tragedy no one could have imagined.